nanihippo nis shiva e ustanif ntatama nanivisto skotskove hine no wa nishni a
Hi Lance, I'm very glad to meet you. You are an American native, a Southern Cheyenne, or are you American citizen?
The American government, the people in America have American passports. I carry an American passport because it's the only way I can travel. I am Tsististas, and my people, of course, were in the place that is called America long before America existed. And I know that in the minds of many Americans and Europeans, it's difficult to understand this concept. It may be because of a vocal political body that many people don't believe anybody would have existed there before, but we did, along with at least 90 million other indigenous people. But after the invasion, first from the Europeans, and then the response to the invasion was that we would put up resistance. By 400 years after the invasion, 90 million people were reduced to 150,000. And this is genocide. And genocide is a living ghost among many indigenous populations, including the populations in America. We are tribal. We live tribal lives. We are indigenous. And today, there are approximately 600 tribes living in America. Roughly 2/3 of those tribes still carry on their traditions and ceremonies and languages.
Where do your people live today? In the reservations or in all the American land?
Oklahoma was the 48th state created out of what is called America. And it's one of the last states admitted to the American Union. So Oklahoma was a dumping ground for tribes. It was no man's land. It was a very wild place. And it was inhabited by very famous outlaws like and the Dalton brothers, who have become famous Western outlaws, and indigenous people. During the time of signing of treaties to supposedly end the wars between tribes in America, many tribes were forced from their lands to other places. And 37 tribes were forced into Jesse James, a very small place that was called No Man's Land, and now it's called Oklahoma. And the Tsististas were removed from Montana, forced to walk to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory, and a remnant of them fought their way back in 1878, which is one of the most heroic stories of a people going home that exists in the history of the world. But this story is not told. And it was my people who decided to fight their way home back to Montana. The government was caused to recognize this, and a reservation was created in Montana, and the Northern Cheyenne reside there, the Northern Tsististas. The Southern Cheyenne, the Southern Tsististas, live still in what is now Oklahoma. There are 37 tribes living in Oklahoma, and there isn't enough land to make reservations because we're living with Americans and other minorities. So most of the tribes live on reserve land, which is land that is held in trust by the American government. And we live with other American people, but we own a parcel of tribal land upon which our tribal offices are built, and the administration buildings are there, and we carry on the life way. And then individual Tsististas own land that is theirs. And I have a small parcel of land in Oklahoma. So
I was in a Navajo reservation, and I remember a lot of degradation, place very different. I know that more indigenous natives are imprisoned by alcohol, drugs, and poverty. It's true?
Yes. One of the effects of colonialism is low self-esteem, feeling of worthlessness. And this malady, this sickness, has been identified by several professional indigenous psychologists in the last 15 years. There's a brilliant book written by Eduardo and Bonnie Duran. Eduardo Duran is Apache Italian, and his wife Bonnie is a Yaqui, a tribe from the Mexican regions. They wrote a book called Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. This book is, well, first of all, this book was banned by the American Psychiatric Association because of the information within it. It literally derides all of the psychological approaches to indigenous peoples from the Western view of psychology. And what this book says is that the indigenous people of America have been made miserable by colonialism, that the American government doesn't care about this, about these people, and their approach using Native American medicines and Jungian psychology is that they have discovered that the major disorder among indigenous peoples who are displaced is grief. Grief is the largest factor in the degradation of their lives. Under the category of grief, they denote several mental disorders. Alcoholism, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress, self-abuse, and all of these disorders, the Durans will claim, are not diseases, but symptoms of a larger disease, grief. Grief of what? The loss of land. Land is spiritual to indigenous people. Upon it are part of the living force of indigenous life. And when these things are removed, the people feel lost, and simply are, because they are not permitted to use the medicines that are ceremonial, and that disease. They're displaced in cities, the medicines, the plants that grow. There were American policies to steal children from their homes during my mother's generation. She was one of them. My uncles, my aunt were all victims of this, stolen from their homes, sent miles away to government schools. And this was the effort of church and state in America to literally take the Indian out of the Indian, and to the demise of many indigenous people. They were successful. But indigenous people are resilient, and my uncles and my aunt survived this onslaught against their souls. My mother was not so fortunate. My mother was stolen from her home at the age of 6 and sent several hundred miles away to a school in Kansas. She was very beautiful, and I firmly am committed to the knowledge that she was abused by both priests and priestesses in this school. She tried to run away at the age of 9 after being there for 3 years. And when she was captured, she had to wear a ball and chain on her leg. And I have spoken to many tribal people in America of my generation as well, not only my mother's generation, who were victimized by these schools. It is a huge issue today, and lawsuits have been filed against churches and the American government.
I think that the diseases, like the syndromes we treat in Italy with our medical organization, the people with the heightened sensibility, like the American natives, are suffering the same symptoms of your. I'm sure that the ceremonies and the ritual people and the knowledge are very important for the mental health of the people.
I couldn't agree with you more. In fact,
Say you are speaking is
for the mistreatment that occurred. I know, and I met with the Durans in Albuquerque, and one of them was, in the future, how do you see this trauma of grief affecting the world? And Eduardo said to me, the trauma of peoples will only grow. And he cited Europe. He said in Europe there are many displaced peoples. They're having to leave the bones of their ancestors to go to other places, and in these other places they are treated differently. Racism and the endemic diseases begin to appear. He said they are not accepted, unfortunately, in his perception. The grief and trauma will only be spread more upon this planet. The imagery of dreams, the imagery of flying, of walking, of seeing yourself in a positive way in a dream, these are the things that trauma affects, that trauma destroys. And the problem is how to reintroduce this basic imagery into the human psyche, because it's there. It simply has to be found, and if it can be found, there can be healing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Tool today in USA, it still speaks of racism toward the Mexicans or of the blacks.
Oh, I'd simply like to add that one of the causes of poverty among the tribes is the fact that the American government entered into over 1,000 treaties with tribes. And what was promised as an example to the Tsististas, if we put down our rifles that we used for hunting, if we gave them our hunting knives, if we stopped being the nomadic people we were, the American government would furnish us with food, with meat, with the supplies we need, and with money. Money for health programs, money for education. If you look at the American dollar, if you look at it today, it's devalued in Europe to about 69 cents. Since the first treaty was made with tribes in America, we have only received 3 cents on $1. And you cannot run programs for your people, for their welfare, on 3 cents on a dollar. And that's one of the huge problems we face today. Forcing the American government to admit its mistakes, they simply refuse, they turn away, and I'll be talking about that later regarding the indigenous populations of the world. But racism is taught in a very subtle way in the schools in America. It is taught even without the racism knowledge of the teachers, because history is excluded from young minds who need this information. And it's not only in the schools, it's also apparent in many museums where indigenous people from America are spoken about in past tense. And yet the cultures of Africa, the cultures of other tribes of the world are spoken in present tense. When a child goes to a museum, a white American child with his or her notebook, and they write this information down, what is the perception in their minds? The indigenous people of America are disappeared. So regarding this kind of information, there breeds a very subtle form of racism. And as this person grows older and has to experience things like 9/11, I have many indigenous friends and minority friends in America who, after 9/11, were frightened and had to quit their jobs and move back to their home communities because of the apparent patriotism, which is actually racism, against them. So it is another one of the other endemic problems in America. Since I was invited to do this interview as a poet and as a professor, I began to listen more keenly at information coming from America. I have the good fortune to have National Public Radio here in Europe, which is, for me, a great news gathering agency. On NPR 3 weeks ago, I heard an interview by a very famous, renowned Native American writer, Sherman Alexie. And I know Sherman Alexie. I've read with him in America. He's a young writer from the Spokane tribe, Spokane in Washington. And he made some comments that were hideously dangerous for me regarding the literary movement of indigenous peoples in America. His comments were humorous, but quite visceral regarding traditional values among tribes in America. And his statements were, for me, statements of an assimilated tribal person. In America, there are two types of persons who are indigenous: the ones who have assimilated or accepted the American mainstream ideology, credo, and then the traditional indigenous person who upholds language and system of values. And Alexie has always derided the traditional view. And his statements, of course, were widely accepted by the American literary establishment. They want to hear this. They want to hear that his generation, which is my son's generation, of indigenous people, willing to open their arms to peoples in America, are very willing to America and say, yes, we will assimilate, we will give up our languages and our cultures. And I see this movement in America, and I perceive it to be very dangerous, and I'm doing my best to confront that. I was born into a tribe that has always maintained traditional values, and I simply don't understand how, as indigenous people in America, we can accept what happened to our mothers and our fathers. I don't respect any nation that would steal somebody's mother and rape them and then ask to be forgiven. I'm sorry, I just can't do that.
In your country, especially into the reservations, that in the past are sterile land, now is find more and more minerals and oil. What is the plan of the government, the USA government, and I speak, for example, the Black Hills?
Theoretically, if we were to take a white sheet and place it on America, the first thing you would see would be blood coming from certain spots on the sheet. This is where tribal people live, where we have died, and where we have lived and died protecting what is underneath that blood: minerals, I don't think I think it's sadly ironic that the recent cave in Utah, where several miners were trapped. The research on this mountain is that it never should have been mined in the first place. Most of the minerals have been taken out of it. And the reason for the cave-in is that a mining company, what we can find, the walls are too weak, are gone. What the owner of this and those mines, this mountain is angry, so we will not mine there anymore. In the mythological traditions of indigenous people all over the world, these sacred places are alive, and they will respond to their endangerment. And it is these, we go in and take what's symbolic references. Whenever there is a disaster created by humans on this planet, tribal people understand the reality of those disasters because it's in our mythologies. So, I forgot your question. Oh, yes. Yeah. Bush has opened up lands that are under federal protection in America and in Alaska. Yosemite National Park, Grand Canyon, the Black Hills. These places are open now to mining and geological exploration for oil companies, because America is desperate to try to find fossil fuels so it can be from, which it will never be, foreign fossil fuels. This program will not change with the Democrats, and today the Democrats are reminiscent of peoples who have been completely disempowered. They have no power, yet they're trying to put up a huge force against the Republicans for the next presidency. The next president will simply inherit Bush's policies. And America is locked in to a system more independent around the world. Know when and because it is violent, cannot be violent and expect good to come from it. I believe there are many Americans who are knowledgeable about the environment. This documentary by, who was it? Gore, Al Gore, was a huge calling card for environmentalists in America, and they exist. Unfortunately, they have no power, and this is the problem.
We know that the Western governments use only the violence to speak the word. For example, like in Iraq. Why, according to you, he always falls in this temptation for the conquest of the economic power or for the gradual impoverishment of our culture?
I moved to Europe about 16 years ago because I couldn't live in America. I can return to America, but I can only stay there a month or two, and then I have to come back. I have to go someplace else. I cannot stay there in my own homeland. I'm not comfortable there. I'm a pariah as a person. I do not believe in the validity of any nation. I believe in the power of and sustaining courage of human beings. And living here in Italy, I see racism directed toward me on trains, when I travel alone because of the way I look. And people are afraid. The foundation of racism is fear. And the people who create fear, the terrorists of the world, know this exactly. They know exactly what they're doing. To control fear in a human being is the goal of terrorism. And the victims are often the people who are displaced. They are the people who have accepted and implanted sectarianism that causes them in their own nations to look at somebody else as inferior. There are supposed to be agencies and theologies to stop this. But today we see these theologies cooperating with them. And if you want to destroy a culture, demythologize it. Demythologize its societal structure, its theology, and you will be in control of whoever those people are by political rule. Today, we see alienation. What is frightening in this alienation is that there seem to be no positive leaders standing up and stepping forward. I feel the real problem today. There are a lot of political, religious, there's a lot of political religious dogma being thrown through the media and through political and religious circles. And these two disciplines should never be allowed to rule. Why can't we be a people who have a strong political, intellectual mode and also a very strong spiritual foundation? Why do we have to make a spiritual, political, dogmatic point of view? Done to control. And my work with the indigenous people in Geneva since 1988, in meeting with them and talking with them, I learned important things from them. First of all, man-made boundaries today are called nations, but they're not. They're boundaries to keep people in, to put people out, and to control. And that may seem very simple. And maybe as an idea, it sounds too simple. But it is what's happening in the world, and people feel lost, simply lost. Where are the foundations? Where are the beliefs that instill in people strength, the strength to stand up against what is victimizing them?
You have taken part to the Cheyenne Sun Dance. The ceremonies are important for the Cheyenne people. What's represent for you?
For the Tsististas people, our ceremonies are the foundation of our life. And we are a people who practice these ideologies with our bodies, not with our minds. We participate physically in rituals and in ceremonies. And we carry this knowledge with us wherever we go. In my home, I have the evidence of the Cheyenne Sundance. I have all of the ceremonial items that I use there, and they are my foundation wherever I am. This concept is being lost by many indigenous people. It's being caused to be lost by colonialism. And there are so many ways I could talk about this, but I want to be positive about talking about the ceremonies and their existence. I would tell you a brief mythological story. It's a story from Europe, but it's a story for the world. There was, a long time ago, on the planet upon which we live, a time when animals and people spoke and communicated. It's in the mythologies of the world. There was a very powerful god who was whose job it was to go out and save people, to kill monsters and to save communities. And he had a son. One day his son was out hunting, looking in the woods for things, and saw a bird that had been injured. It was a very beautiful bird. He didn't see a bird like that ever. And this bird's song was a song he had never heard. It was a very beautiful song. And when the bird sung the song, the world seemed to get brighter. And other animals would sing. It was beautiful, the song. But it was dying. And he took it to his father, who was dressing to go to kill a monster, and he didn't have time for his son. And he said to his father, "Please, Father, before you leave, I know you have the power to heal this bird. Listen to its song. Look what happens when this bird sings." And the bird sang, and the world became brighter, and it was a good feeling. And the father said, "I don't have time, son. I have a very important mission. I have to go." And he went away, and the bird died. And when the bird died, it became dark on the world. Poets, artists are these birds. And people who understand the disciplines of creativity are these birds. People who, like you, who work to try to bring back the songs, are doing the work that is spoken of in this parable, in this story. And I would offer this story to anyone listening here. They have to find that song within themselves, and that song is their life. What happened with this story is that the song of the bird was the song of the culture, and when the bird died, the culture died. Many people might hear this and say, "Oh, it's okay for you. You're a poet. You live by these stories. I have to work every day." It takes a certain kind of courage to listen to songs like this, to carry them inside you, and to sing them only to yourself. And that kind of courage is missing in the world. I don't think it's missing in most people, but it has been displaced by other ideas and other concepts. And I think it's people like you who have to find these songs for them.
Awake, Shake dreams from your hair, my pretty child, my sweet one. Choose the day and choose the sign of your day, the day's divinity. First thing you see,